Hi, everyone, and welcome back for our final keynote with Reverend Dr. Lisanne Winslow, who is currently a professor at Fairfield University in America. She has a 20-year career as a marine invertebrate immunologist and has involved world ocean marine ecology of an indicator species, such as the sea urchin, in identifying the effects of global climate change. Her scientific studies have informed her theological pursuits in systematic theology, as described in her 2020 book, A Trinitarian Theology for Nature. And her work in divine action theory includes a new view called divine compositionalism, which was pioneered in 2009 with her colleague, Dr. Walter Schultz. Dr. Winslow holds an MSc in biology and a PhD in cell biology from Rutgers, and an MA in theology and religion from the United Theological Seminary, and a PhD in systematic theology and divinity from King's College. She's an ordained minister in the Congregational Church, where she served an ordained minister for more than a decade. In addition to her faculty teaching, I'm not quite sure how you have time to do all of that, Sam. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. And Lisanne's presentation is a biotheology of God's divine action in the present global ecological precipice. So I'll hand over to you, Lisanne. What I will do is I will wave frantically, or probably put my mic on when we get to a point where you've got sort of 15 minutes left for Q&A if you haven't quite wrapped up by then. Just so we've got some time for Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Finn, for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to stop for a moment and just thank Finn and Matt and all the coordinators for putting together such a packed and diverse program for us to engage with all new ideas and thinking these past 2 days. And thank you so much to all of the speakers who have shared their work with us. I feel like I'm coming to this final keynote here, standing on the shoulders of amazing colleagues. And so thank you. I hope to weave in some of the concepts and thoughts that we've heard these past 2 days and hopefully bring things together in maybe a new way of thinking about God's divine action. And I just want to also extend my thanks to all of the participants for the great questions that have pushed me to think in newer and deeper and more profound ways about my own work and the work of others. So I'm humbled and honored to be here. Now, Finn, as you mentioned when you gave the introduction, I've been a scientist all of my life. And as I have traveled the world with my students to many different biomes and ecosystems, primarily marine, but also I've taken students to the rainforest and to other parts of the world to study the biological world. What I've seen, my friends, is a severe and dramatic decimation of the natural world just over the course of my career. And we know that the science does not really move people's hearts. The scientists can come out with all kinds of data and present us with all kinds of facts, but people just seem to ignore it and aren't really taking it seriously. So it was about almost 15 years ago where I realized I was fortunately teaching at a Christian liberal arts university in the Midwest, where I was afforded to integrate science and theology. And I thought I really needed the training to do this well. And so I went back for my second set of academic training to be able to engage this issue from a divine action perspective. What is God up to? What is our responsibility as humans? And how to reach people? How do we reach people? And I think the only way really is through a change of the human heart. So with that little preamble, let me begin. So right now, all of the Earth's ecosystems, along with a concatenation of human and non-human creatures, are in serious crisis. This strong statement has been corroborated, by climate and environmental scientists from 150 countries who agree that we are now at what they're calling code red in a planetary ecological crisis. So in terms of the theological discourse around the environmental crisis, what I've seen is that it has rightly focused and brought to the forefront human agency as the primary causal determinant, but yet with very little dialogue around divine action. So toward that end, in this presentation, I hope that we can explore a theistic divine action position toward an account of the present global precipice that the Earth and all of its creatures are teetering upon. And so to do this, I'm going to present to you a preferred view of divine action theory, which we call divine compositionalism, that I believe holds the explanatory power to account for an ever-changing planet. And then divine compositionalism will be used to ground the role of God as creator and sustainer of all things toward a hopeful and constructive biotheology. So let's begin. Any theological dialogue regarding the imminent global ecological catastrophe must address the role and culpability of human free will in producing the destruction of habitat and gross misuse of resources. And you can see some of the effects of this in these images on the right. While simultaneously, in constructive theistic analysis, a theology of God's divine action and purpose must likewise be addressed, but in terms of many of the concepts we've been hearing over the past 2 days. We have to account for God's sovereignty and nature's autonomy, determinism or indeterminism, God's intervention or God's non-intervention. So what one wonders as we contemplate human activity, the anthropocentric activities that have caused what we are currently in, and God's divine action, you sit back and you wonder, what is God up to? Is God working in the midst of this present ecological precipice that we find ourselves navigating? Has the creator of all life given free rein to humankind, kenotically sitting back to watch the human race destroy in less than 500 years, where it took 13.8 billion years to create? So the question that any divine action view must address is why would the creator God, the one who, according to biblical theology, owns and loves the earth and everything in it, allow such a thing? So the question for us today is, might there be an alternative understanding where the current global environmental crisis serves as an integral ingredient in a constructive evolutionary progression for humanity, the earth, and all of the creatures that live upon the earth? So to begin, first, I just want to briefly review the current state of the planetary ecology. And I'm just going to give you kind of like an ecology 101 here. I'm not even going to give you the full Monty on this because we'll all jump off the roof if I do. So let's just begin with understanding what I mean when I say the present climate crisis. In the present climate crisis we are in, we have seen the devastating effects of human consumption and waste disrupting the ecological balance of our planet. Resources are significantly depleted, where humans, due to unsustainable anthropogenic activities, have created a problem of epic proportion. Plastic and toxic waste has polluted our land, every single waterway, marine and freshwater, even to the outer reaches of our atmosphere. Terrestrial and marine ecosystems are suffering from ecological instability, habitat loss, extreme drought, weather abnormalities, wildfires all over the country. Even in Siberia in the mid of winter, fires are burning. Many ecosystems are on the verge of irreversible collapse. C.C. Sumut, theologian, in 2020 stated this. He said, nature is being affected by humans to such an extent that the continued existence of the world is seriously called in question. Meeting basic human needs was supplanted by this is the key, spiritual degradation of selfishness, greed, apathy, and dominance, producing the sickness of a consumer society. According to Sumut and many others, what is described as an environmental and ecological problem really stems from a deeper spiritual problem. So you can see why, as a biologist, I realized I could not address this issue with science alone. Science did not have the vocabulary and the means necessary to address this problem because it's a spiritual problem. So from a divine action perspective, the current serious environmental crisis creates a theological tension between the sovereign, loving creator God that we've heard so much about in the past 2 days, in whose hands are the depths of the earth and the mountain peaks that belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and in his hands formed the dry land. And the destructive, sinful actions of humanity, whom God has sought to regenerate, redeem, and refine out of infinite love for God's glory. Where is this God in the midst of our planet's imminent and present global crisis. How could God have let this get this far out of control? So to answer this question, it may seem to presuppose three divine action alternatives. And we've heard some of this over the past few days. I'm going to go through this quickly. It's a bit of a review. One, we can ascribe to a non-present God who set the earth machine in motion, perhaps just hasn't taken a look in a while. That's deism. Two, God is acting in kenotic self-restraint, merely sustaining the current trajectory. This is known as mere conservationism. We heard earlier in Ellie's talk, she referred to something called partial deism. Three, a theistic view where God is present. God is responsible for primary causation, concurring with human actions as natural consequences of sin and secondary causation, and that's concurrentism. Now, in my view, any of these scenarios that you pick 1 through 3 above, God's divine action is non-action and stands counter to a biblical doctrine of creation where we find the biblical God who loves and owns the creation, cares for it, and has filled the creation with the knowledge and glory of God. In the biblical view, God is intimately involved with all environmental activities moment by moment, and there's no biblical evidence that this will cease to be the case. And I've thrown some scriptures in there for your reference. Now, but perhaps an occasionalist view might come closest to the biblical theology, but however, as we know, poses God as the sole causal agent of every event, aka God becomes the author of evil, God seems to violate God's love for the creation and the environmental degradation that we see, and it also violates human will. So this is problematic on 3 accounts. So is there a satisfying theistic divine action account that we can use to think about and fix this tension? So the question becomes, is it possible to hold together in a coherent account, 1, the destruction of our Earth's habitat, 2, human free will and culpability, absolutely, and 3, God's imminent divine action in a creation that God intimately cares for and loves? So to answer this question, I will present the divine action view called divine compositionalism. Then I'm going to formulate a biblical account that seeks to overcome the tension inherent in reconciling a biblically grounded account of God's action within the current climate crisis, while retaining human free will, agency, and culpability. And I know this is a tall order, and you're thinking, there's no way she's going to be able to do this. And I don't know if I can, but we're going to try. We're going to try together. Now, the basis of this account is God's supreme love for the works of God's hands. God loves God's works. The human and other than human creatures, and how God does this is by acting on condition out of that love for the evolution, redemption, restoration, fullness, and interrelation of all human, non-human, and geological creatures of our world and our universe. Okay, so to begin with divine compositionalism, first we want to state right off the bat is that biblical theology narrates a theological position that the earth was made for humans and humans were made for the earth. Now, the construct instantiating this creational relationship consists of a universe that we perceive of matter and energy that operates within a set of regularities known mechanistically as the laws of nature. Now, extant divine action views such as deism, mere conservationism, concurrentism, and occasionalism have informed theological ways of thinking regarding natural laws and God's divine action causation in the natural world. So if we just take a look at them on this continuum I have for you here, we see deism on the left, which is, of course, the least causal power, and then occasionalism all the way on the right, which God has total causal power, and then we've got these intermittent views in between. Now, if we just take a look at the 3 on the left, deism, mere conservationism, and concurrentism, in these 3 positions, nature has either total or some measure of autonomy. This is theologically incoherent since it ascribes nature to have God-like abilities. Rather, biblical theology informs that nature reveals the knowledge and glory of God. And I will tell you, this is I'm working on this actively right now. I had some great conversations in the breakout rooms with some of my colleagues on this. In the biological world, nature has total autonomy, right? We have random chance mutation is driving everything. And there's a new field called epigenetics, where now nature and environmental factors can feedback on the genome and can cause mutations to satisfy environmental conditions. So there's this nature is autonomous, nature is creating things, nature is making its own decisions about things. And so, I'm trying to reconcile this with biblical theology. So biblical theology informs that nature reveals the knowledge and glory of God, supremely valuable, right? But nature has no free will. Nature does not have intrinsic creative ability. Nature was created to reveal the knowledge and glory of God, but it was humans that have been given this agency. We were created in the image of God, the imago Dei, whereas nature was not. So a new view, divine compositionalism, was proposed by Dr. Walter Schultz and I more than a decade ago. And the crux of this is divine compositionalism ascribes first God's moment by moment, compositional, existence conferring, efficient causation according to God's eternally existent ideas. And so you see back on our continuum, divine compositionalism is going to lie somewhere between concurrentism and occasionalism in terms of God's causal power. Now, God creates not out of an ontological disposition to create, but out of infinite, eternal, unending fountain of agape love for the earth, all non-human creatures, and all of the human beings created in God's image to thrive together in growing, harmonious, and evolving relationships. And we heard Luca speak a few minutes ago about those goods and very goods in Genesis. If you notice from the Genesis 1 scripture that Luca gave to us, God doesn't say that the creation is very good until all of the creatures are created. They are all living in harmonious, evolving relationship together. That is when creation becomes very good. And so just a shout out to Ignacio for thank you for giving us that wonderful background in your talk. So I don't need to go through this because Ignacio has already done that. He gave us a wonderful historical perspective on divine action views. Here are some of the contemporary theistic divine action views. We've already heard about almost all of these in one or other of talks, so I won't go through this. But let's see how divine compositionalism compares with these contemporary theistic views of divine action. So divine compositionalism envisions the natural universe manifested compositionally and processually by God's moment-by-moment existence conferring action. And I love what Gavin said in his talk this morning, that God is writing a love story. If I could capture divine compositionalism in one phrase, Gavin, that is it. So thank you for giving me that sentence today. And we describe this in a 5-category ontology. Now, this ontology is derived from biblical theology, where, of course, we start with the presupposition that God exists. 2, God is aware of God's omnicompetence. And notice that Walter and I are using the word omnicompetence and not omnipotence, not because God is not omnipotent, yes, absolutely, but in an ordered domain of real possibilities that exist in the actual world that God has created. God is aware of what God is going to do in this world that we live in. Everything is possible for God, but in this ordered domain of real possibilities that we have, God is aware of what God can do. For example, right now, a butterfly could fly past me in my office here, could have gotten in through the door, could have flown in, and it's possible. That is a real possibility. But a pink polka dotted elephant floating by my office right now, probably not. Not that God is not capable of doing that, but we are ascribing in our ontology that God has created an ordered domain of actual possibilities that will occur in the world that God has created. And God is aware of that range of possibilities. And as such, God has made commitments to bring those possibilities to fruition. And so God's commitments to act on condition, and I'll explain what this means in a few moments, are what are the dispositions of entities, molecules, atoms, ecosystems, everything, dispositions of every entity on earth. So God has made a commitment to act on condition to manifest dispositions. God acts consistently in what we perceive as forces, and God acts coordinatedly to form the structures and the higher order mechanisms that we see that science is reporting. So this ontology translates into a continuous creation out of divine ideas for the sequential evolutionary unfolding of the actual world that can be represented conceptually by the following graphic. Now, I know this looks really messy, but I'm going to go through it with you point by point. So this sigma x is a situation. Situation x, every quantum, atomic, molecular event, every structure, every force in the natural world. This set that you see here, this range of I's, is a set of initiating conditions for the manifestation of situation X out of a range or set of initiating conditions that God will enact based on God's plans and purposes. So part of this is part of the domain of actual possibilities. Delta is some duration of time over evolutionary history, Earth's natural history. Situation X prime is the subsequent state of the system, where M and the range of M is the manifestation of the disposition of situation X to enact the subsequent state of the system out of a range of possible manifestations that will result due to God's commitment to act on condition, and then D prime is some later time. So the statement above, this long graphic here, basically reads the following. A situation X, an event, structure, force in the natural world that is subject to an initiating condition out of a range or set of initiating conditions within God's awareness of his omnicompetence that God intends to enact on condition at some duration of time, resulting in the manifestation of the disposition of situation X to produce situation X prime out of a range or set of manifestations that will occur at a subsequent duration of time. Now, in this divine action model, God is conferring existence by manifesting dispositions, forces, and structures, higher order mechanisms, in each subsequent state of a system from a previous state of the system to unfold God's plans and purposes for the evolution and furtherance of the natural world. And so this can be conceptualized by this little graphic here, where here is situation X, and then something happens, and here is situation X prime, where it has changed or manifested in some way. And you see these interesting arrows I have here of different colors. So the vertical arrows represents God's existence conferring action. So God is conferring existence to situation X, and then God is conferring existence to the next subsequent state of the system, situation X prime. And the right arrow, which is where we normally ascribe causality, we usually in science, we say all the magic is happening in the arrow, right? That's where the chemistry is happening, right? No, the arrow represents God's commitment to act on the conditions that are set up in the world to enact the next state of affairs. So in our model, God does not encounter stuff. God doesn't encounter a world. So it's not like the Far Side cartoon I have here, where here is God, and God's kind of holding the earth and going, yeah, well, maybe it's not quite, maybe I'll tweak a little here. So God doesn't encounter stuff in our view. In fact, it's kind of what Gavin said. I hope you don't mind I'm picking on you, Gavin. But Gavin said something this morning that really touched my heart. It said, creation is waking into being. That is exactly what we're trying to say in divine compositionalism, that God does not encounter a preformed world that God made some eras ago and then tweaking it. God is creating out of divine ideas moment by moment. So rather, in this God-world relation, the actual world of our universe exists within God, who intimately confers existence to every physical state of every system. So this is a panentheist view. And as such, God is the only causal power. There are no intrinsic powers. There's no brute forces in this view. Powers are perceived by us based on our consistent experience with apparent causal relations. So scientifically, when we try to isolate the power causing a reaction, that's that arrow that I had going across in yellow, we find systems within systems of entities manifesting dispositions. You cannot isolate the power. And if you're interested, I don't have a lot of time to do this today because I have other things to talk to you about, but please read my paper with Walter in 2018 in Theology and Science, where we actually do this. We deconstruct this scientifically and theologically and metaphysically in this paper, The Solubility of Salt, a Theistic Account. I'll show you a little example right now. So let's just say we have a scientific reaction of some chemical A plus some chemical B, and they're going to come together magically by that arrow. Some chemistry is going to happen and make them come together to form A and B. We know this primarily. This is a really simple example. Sodium plus chloride gives us table salt, and here you see some crystals on the side, right? In divine compositionalism, we would say that God would will sodium into existence with its positive cation. God would will chloride into its existence with its negative cation. Those are its dispositions. And then God will act on commitment to produce that ionic bond of sodium chloride. So we can say, where are the entities? Sodium and chloride are there. God wills them into existence with their ionic dispositions. What is the causal process? God is conferring existence according to God's plans and purposes. God wants sodium and chloride on the earth for all the reasons we know, to fill the oceans and for our bodies. Those are the red arrows. And then God is enacting the states of this system moment by moment, which concurs with biblical theology. Where are the powers that are causing the reaction? There are no brute powers outside of God's divine acting. So what is the yellow arrow? The yellow arrow is our experience of God's commitment to act, God's existence conferring action. It is what we would call, in Walter and I term in this paper, as perceived causation. Now, the explanatory power in this model comes from those ranges of possibilities I showed you earlier, the initiating conditions and the manifestations that are inherent in the domain of possibilities that God has. And we remind you of this little equation that we talked about before. And so this range of possibilities avoids strict determinism in lieu of the vast, nearly infinite possible combinations that can exist for the geology, the chemistry, the physics, and the biology of life on Earth. We do not know how many initiating conditions God has. I have it as I sub n. We do not know how many manifestations God has. I have it as m sub n, all throughout evolutionary history. Now, this model also accounts for laws of nature, such as gravity, weak and strong nuclear forces, electromagnetism, etc., which represent God's consistent action in a set of m sub 1. Now, when I say an m sub 1, it means that if we're constantly seeing, if I drop a pen, it's going to always fall to the ground. Right, gravity is always going to behave. We have a constant. We've mapped out the mathematics of gravity. The planets will always orbit the sun. The electron will always be attracted to a proton. So sometimes God can have an m sub 1, or there may be other m's that we just don't see, that God is consistently picking one m within a wide range of initiating conditions, and we perceive these and experience these as regularities. The great theologian Thomas Torrance viewed these regularities, we've named them natural laws, as God's consistent acting or God's faithfulness. Divine compositionalism concurs with this and acknowledges that, within the domain of real possibilities, there are going to be some conditions where there may be only one initiating condition or one m that exists that God created that way, or that's the only one that God's choosing, and that's the one we consistently see. Now, while divine compositionalism might at first glance seem to hold God as the sole causal agent of every event, it supplants traditional occasionalism with the notion that only in nature does God act in an occasionalist manner, enacting every causal relation in physical states of systems from the near infinite range of possibilities of the initiating conditions and manifestations. In terms of sentient beings who have been given free will, God acts in a concurrentist manner. And so that's why in that continuum I showed you before, DC lands between concurrentism and occasionalism, because with humans, we're going to see that co-creation that we've all been enjoying and talking about, right, this week. And so that's where we see the co-creation is in the way that God is working within and through humans and sentient beings in a concurrentist manner. Now, this separation of God's acting into two separate components, God acts in one way in the natural world, which is completely contingent and not autonomous, and then God working within human agents in a concurrentist manner. This relieves three important elements of theological tensions that are inherent in other views. One, God is intimately involved with and sovereign over all events in the physical states of the world. This aligns with biblical theology. Two, God is not the agent of evil or sin in this model. And this preserves human free will and human culpability, which overcomes the flaws that are inherent in occasionalism. So nature, being in a state of full contingency, does not have free will, but humans do. And a similar idea, many of you might be saying, wow, this sounds like Plantinga. Well, yeah, it does, because Plantinga, published in 2016, 8 years after Walter and I published, but it's Alvin Plantinga, he published this as weak occasionalism. which again is almost very similar to what Walter and I have proposed, meaning that there's different modes of divine action in natural events and in the universe, natural events in the universe and among humans. This model also accounts for when we do not see or experience the expected regularities. In our faith traditions, we know these happenings as miracles. And we've heard even this week that some divine action views strain with this. This is an issue we have to overcome. How do we understand this? These views strain with the account of miracles, since God has to find a way into the creation. God has to override pre-existing natural laws. We don't like that. And so divine compositionalism simply overcomes this tension, since God does not encounter a creation. God doesn't encounter stuff that he has to manage or manipulate or override. God is conferring existence moment by moment. So if God is conferring existence based on situation X and then manifesting situation X prime, then every event is God selecting a possible manifestation from the range of manifestations, where the red M1 in this little model here is a regularity that God consistently chooses. Let's just say water cannot hold a human body unless you can swim. Okay, if you can't swim, you're going to sink. But M3 in green represents another manifestation that we do not consistently see, but God can just choose to manifest according to God's plans, purposes, and providence. And so, okay, on that day, Jesus walked on the water that day. God chose a different M from the range. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not a possible, one of those possibilities from the actual world. And so you see in this model, God does not have to find a way into the creation. We don't have to explain how miracles are God overriding laws or working within existing systems, because God is just willing something that we don't usually see. And that's what we know as a miracle. So now we have to answer these two questions about determinism, indeterminism, and so on. So one, is divine compositionalism a determinist view or an indeterminist view? Well, divine compositionalism holds components of both determinism and indeterminism. And let me show you how. In a deterministic divine action view, we all know that all events, including human actions, are predetermined by God and are therefore inevitable. In DC, only the events in physical systems, all mechanisms of nature, thereby we avoid human agent determinism altogether in this model, are determined by the range of possibilities in the actual world, the dispositions, forces, and structures, and the range of initiating conditions and the range of manifestations. Now, in an indeterministic divine action view, God acts within a world where some events occur by chance or without strict causal chain, allowing for greater human freedom and agency. In DC, no events occur by chance. And I'll quote Albert Einstein, who says God does not play dice. I think we've heard that a couple times yesterday and today. But indeterminacy can be ascribed to the range of possibilities from which God chooses to act in nature based on the conditions that God wants to enact. So since God acts in a concurrentist manner with humans, human freedom and agency is retained. Now, if we talk about interventionist or non-interventionist views, divine compositionalism is neither interventionist nor non-interventionist in the traditional sense. Okay, I want to explain this. Now, in an interventionist divine action view, this view ascribes that God actively intervenes in the world, often by breaking or suspending the laws of nature to bring about specific outcomes. We discussed this in Miracles. In DC, God does not encounter a pre-made creation, therefore never has to suspend or violate laws, simply chooses the desired outcome from God's commitments to act on condition to achieve the plans and purposes that God has. A non-interventionist view holds that God acts within the natural order, influencing events without directly altering the established laws of nature, essentially working through existing processes in nature. And again, DC does not have to find a way in to work with existing natural processes, but God is willing the subsequent states of the system according to God's divine acting and God's divine action volition. So in a nutshell, I'll just sum up divine compositionalism, and let's see what we can do with this view. Let's play with it a little bit, okay? So divine compositionalism holds to a fourfold metaphysics that Walter and I have drawn from the Philosophy of Nature of Jonathan Edwards. And you can see I have 2 books that came out in 2020 if you're interested in this, or just email me. I'd love to have dialogue. So first, divine compositionalism is a panentheist view. Nothing exists outside of God. Creation exists within God, allowing for a transcendent God separate from the universe and outside of time, yet immanent in intimate moment by moment causal relation with the creation. And just a little note on this, the way that we perceive time is our perception of God sequentially unfolding the acts that God intends for the earth. So and we have a whole description of time. If that's interesting, we can talk about that later. It describes to a continuous creation. God enacts the creation out of eternally existent ideas that God intends to create. This is a form of race idealism. I don't have time to go through this with you today, but read the books or some of the papers we published on this if this is interesting for you. But basically, while the creation exists within God, panentheism, and God is continually willing the creation into existence, moment by moment, continuous creation, the creation persists. We believe in persistence of objects. They persist in the experience, not ontologically. It persists in the experience of the creatures and are metaphysically real, not ideal. And the divine action is conducted in an occasionalist manner within fully contingent natural system and a concurrentist manner within human agents. So that's DC kind of in a nutshell. So now, divine compositionalism's notion that the universe operates compositionally is underscored by all of the physical theories that we have, that science has given to us, indicating that the universe is not fundamentally a consideration of just objects having certain persistent properties existing in distinct relational states, but rather the universe is compositional, interconnected, and dynamic. And so if you take a look at this chart that I have here for you, this is just the basic metabolic process of cellular aerobic respiration that I teach my students, okay? Look at the complexity of this. This is one small pathway in biochemistry. And so what we know is that there are molecules and forces, everything is acting in a continuous and consistent state of flow. And so we consider this a scientific processual ontology, where all mechanisms that constitute the natural world in its operation are processual. They're happening in a process, seamlessly unfolding in a complex web of interconnected states of being conferred into existence by God. Now, I'll tell you, I've had amazingly well-meaning theologians and pastors come to me and say to me, Lisanne, this is just too much for God to have to do in a day. You know, like God's willing everything into existence. This is just too much for God to do. Like, you know, and I stop and I pause and I say, just, can you listen to what you did? This is too much for God to do. It's like saying Picasso is going to paint this big painting and he's going to have all of these different colors and all these brushstrokes and he's going to do these cubist, you know, geometric and that's too much for Picasso to do and then go have lunch and go visit his family and then go to the store. Like, that's just too much. Picasso couldn't do that, right? And so we anthropomorphize so often when we think of divine action that God is infinite. So this is accomplished by God upholding the commitment to act on condition by manifesting the dispositions, forces, and higher order structures that you see here on exemplified on the right to accomplish the unfolding of God's plans and intents for the biological evolution and geochemical unfolding of the biosphere, and of course the entire universe moment by moment, every Planck scale moment. So this ontology is carefully derived from the biblical doctrine of God and reflects Scripture's portrayal of God as speaking and willing, right? These are forms of acting. And God's compositional acting basically is the world in which we live and move and experience one another, our breath, the chill of a winter's day, the sea spray on our face, every facet of our existence. So what science reports to us and does so well, and I've lived my life in this arena, what science reports in mechanisms, equations, formulas, and models are descriptions of what God is doing moment by moment. Science was reporting to us the ways God is acting. And I love this quote by Einstein in his letter to Schrodinger in 1935. He says, the real difficulty lies in the fact that physics is a kind of metaphysics, right? Physics describes reality, but we don't even know what reality is. We only know it by means of the physical descriptions. And he's straining here with the ontology, and he's saying, okay, I can describe, you know, the mass of an electron, and I can just, you know, I can understand that a proton has, you know, 3 up quarks and 2 down spin quarks. DC would say to Albert, you want to know what reality is, Albert? Reality is God's existence conferring action. So a biblical understanding of God's immanent creative action naturally originates in God's eternal ideas for the created order, which include all possible scenarios of a changing ecology of plants, animals, ecosystems within a gradually evolving geology and climate that unfolds chronologically. We perceive this as time. God's divine compositionalism grounds this unfolding of life patterns in a processual biotheology, where every step of ecological history serves a vital purpose in executing the divine ideas for the next evolutionary step to take place. Now, this biocentric theology is derived from biblical theology of a God who is actively present, enacting and unfolding the earth in what we have described as in science as laws and mechanisms, physiology, evolutionary progression, and so on. I love how Sally McFaig described this. She said, creation, the gift of the Spirit, could be seen as the action of God. Creation is the action of God, she's saying, in the eons of evolutionary development, which has resulted in the wonderful life we see about us as well as in ourselves. And so seemingly dead-end species and waste all have value and serve purpose, even if not intuitively perceived by us. In this way, God compositionally creates, continually constructing the whole universe, advancing an evolutionary trajectory of increasing complexity and beauty. Well, this is a lovely theology, except for when it's not, right? In other words, how do we account for God's acting in a not so wonderful world amidst the degradation of biological life and the human activities that got us here? And I show you two images. One is the decimation of the coral reefs. 2/3 of our coral reefs are gone. In the upper photo, this is showing you the decimation of the rainforest. And this happens to be in the country of Belize, which I flew over in an airplane with my daughters and saw just what you're seeing here, complete decimation. What is God doing? How do we understand God's acting in this scenario? So to address this, we have to come back to the question I posed earlier. Can an alternative view like divine compositionalism that proposes that every physical state of the universe, all of the Earth's natural history, the structures and ecology originate out of divine ideas? God had an idea the Earth was going to look like this now, manifested in God's moment by moment existence. God's manifesting this. Can this account for what is happening now if that action has included devastating pollution and degradation of the creation itself at the hands of one species in that creation? Well, divine compositionalism proposes that God's existence conferring action is building and constructing ecologies and trophic levels that lay the foundation for subsequent iterations of diversity and biological emergence. Therefore, the current crisis that we are in can be viewed evolutionarily and organically, even as devastating as it is. Production of creaturely waste is consistent with a theme that has existed since the beginning of life on Earth. This is nothing new. All of Earth's ecosystems, bar none, have had to deal with creaturely waste. Waste is always produced in every sphere of the creation. In fact, evolution is on some level driven by creaturely waste, followed by the evolution of creatures or systems that evolve and are involved in the use and reuse of that waste in order to foster another trophic level of ecosystem construction and beauty. And you see this decaying log and these beautiful oyster fungi on here decaying this log, right? So this is nothing new in creation. Over the course of evolution, there is always a system or an organism that evolves to use the waste products from the previous organisms, the geological events, or climatological systems that will serve to recycle and reincorporate the waste toward productive and beautiful ends. This is how ecosystems are consistently built. For example, as speculated in the primordial Earth, toxic gases and emissions from volcanic eruptions and noxious gaseous fusions were needed. They were absolutely needed to give rise to first order conditions for life to exist. Early microorganisms then evolved to use these toxic components. And please forgive this image here. ChatGPT and I tried very hard to work up something for you, and this was the best it could come up with. But I thought I'd use it for kicks and laughs. The early microorganisms evolved to use these toxic components as the initiating conditions for cellular life to exist and thrive, cleaning up the earth of that toxic waste. And as a byproduct, guess what they did? They produced a noxious waste called methane gas. That was a manifestation. So in every state of the system, God is willing the I, the initiating condition you see in yellow, and the M, the manifestation, to produce the desired outcome according to God's plan for this stage in Earth's development, setting the conditions for the next. So if we keep going along these lines, these pollutants became the vital initiating conditions for forming the Earth's early atmosphere, acting as greenhouse gases that warmed the Earth for other life forms to emerge, and they did. Approximately 2.7 billion years ago, photosynthetic cyanobacteria were able to survive in this environment and to use the toxic CO2 with the sun's energy to convert toxic CO2 into food, glucose, to live. However, these anaerobic photosynthetic microbes produced a toxic gas that we know as oxygen. That was the manifestation of that initiating condition. So this waste accumulated for about 500 million years, becoming the initiating condition, altering the Earth's climate and its biochemistry, which then became the substrate for the next level of development, organisms that used it in aerobic respiration. That was that model I showed earlier, the mechanism I showed you earlier. The climatological atmosphere and conditions from the advent of oxygen-based aerobic respiration were the initiating conditions for all higher organisms to evolve. Plants, fungi. I kind of like this one that ChatGPT did. That's a pretty one. Okay, yeah, okay. Thank you, Finn. You gave a little nod to that. Everything, invertebrates, vertebrate animals, who also all produced waste. And this was eventually managed and incorporated into complex and integrated ecosystems that produced the rich biodiversity, yielding a healthy, balanced environment and a thriving Earth. Now, okay, taking this broad-scaled evolutionary and biocentric view, one might view the waste that humans have produced in plastics, microplastics, hydrocarbons, methane, mercury, all other pollutants. It's yet another form of creaturely waste. It's a manifestation of the initiating condition that we saw in the previous step. Thus, we now find ourselves and the Earth in another condition of toxicity. But here are the key differences. In previous geological eras, the accumulation of extreme levels of toxicity on the Earth and subsequent remediation by God's willing evolutionary solutions typically took millions of years in geological history to unfold, right? But it unfolded complexity, majesty, and magnificence of our stunning planet. Whereas the current accumulation of toxic waste and resultant climatological instability has occurred in only a matter of several hundred. When I tell you this is not even a half an eye blink in geological history, right? 100 years, so several hundred years. Biological waste and climatological change over the course of Earth's geological history were due to natural physiological processes of evolving organisms, whereas now the imbalances are largely due to anthropological events and conscious human choices. And the building of what Rossing and Buitendijk say is an unjust global empire stemming from the spiritual sicknesses we saw earlier of human greed and selfishness, exploitation, oppression, and power that have gotten us here. So the next question is, does divine compositionalism hold the explanatory power to offer a coherent account of God's sovereign causal control over the Earth as it is now in its current state of manifestation, while accounting for human culpability and free will within a redemption arc for both? In other words, can the current global manifestation become the initiating condition for the next beautiful era of the unfolding creation according to God's larger purpose for the Earth and humanity? Well, ChatGPT seems to think so, because here it constructed a really cool kind of like, yeah, I wouldn't mind living on that Earth, all the solar and all that wind. And yeah, okay. I think so. Let's see how. So suppose the entire evolved process of life on Earth is moving towards some completed end. Now, we know this biblically as eschatology, so we can say this biblically and eschatologically speaking. We're moving forward out of eternally derived divine ideas that God intends to create. The remedy seems to be a move for the human species as the contemporary human lineage to evolve into a unified biocentric mindset that acknowledges and allows for political, economic, and cultural differences, but holds these as secondary to the prioritization of a sustainable infrastructure, avowing for its implementation. In this way, just as God has used organisms before to solve the problem of waste and toxicity, God will now use the very animal that caused the toxicity to solve the problem and propel the earth and its creatures. This is the co-creation. This is the concurrentist side of divine compositionalism into the next generation of our shared history. However, this would take a spiritual work of divine acting in the hearts of humans, regardless of religious traditions or none. Just as divine compositionalism affords God's divine acting in nature at this current ecological precipice, as enacting the precursors of a constructive future regarding the creaturely waste, so it affords working within and through the human species toward moral and ethical ends. You see, while humans retain free will, their hearts are the field where the Spirit of God works. So I want to take a brief look at how the human spiritual and anthropological development has fared this far and how we might write the course forward. Quick question, what time am I ending?
If you end by 10:02, it gives us 15 minutes for conversation.
Okay, perfect. So 10 more minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. So if we look anthropologically at human development, humanity has departed in really crucial ways from our human ancestors who lived in earlier evolutionary stages. This is Dupre and Nicholson, if you're interested in reading that. Our success as a biological species was largely due to the interconnectedness, this is important, the interconnectedness that our early hominid ancestors enjoyed with the earth, with one another, and with all other non-human creatures. As we grew and evolved as a species, we made choices, we made decisions about how to structure our lifestyles, our transportation, factories, food, waste, resources, yet without realizing the long-term consequences of these things. The earth and the resources given by the earth were seen as inexhaustible, lasting indefinitely, ever replenished and never running out. This coincided with the explosive population growth during the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at this right here, if you see right around where 1500 is, and you see this is beyond exponential growth, right? Why? Greater food productivity and distribution, higher birth rates and longevity, advances in hygiene and medicine thanks to the scientific revolution, vaccines, this lowered disease and death rates. So with this increase in human population, human ingenuity, which was wonderful on so many levels and has led us here, with it came a spiritual disease. And that spiritual disease was the spiritual temptations toward greed, selfishness, and exploitation. The gravely negative outcome on the environment and on the human spirit of some of these decisions could never have been predicted. So we don't want to demonize these people. They could never have predicted this 250, 300 years ago. The infrastructures that have selected for the waste we see now, the habitat destruction, the misuse and exploitation, they're no longer tenable. The earth and humans we're all suffering. And so the human species is now confronted with how to effect positive environmental modifications as needs have changed. What is needed now is a fundamental biocentric shift in human understanding. We need a spiritual evolution in humanity, a re-envisioning of what life on Earth could look like, taking cues from our earlier anthropology, our earlier ancestors' success. The reason why we're here today is because our ancestors relied on unified cooperation as a species. And this is true for all biological species. Herds of antelope can't survive without the herd, right? We see this, bacteria can't survive. All biological species need to cooperate. However, such a cooperative consciousness of biocentrism requires a societal spiritual evolution of the heart toward a biotheology of, one, valuing one another. No, we have lost the value of one another. You have heard this and I have too. This is the loneliest, most isolated generation in human history. We have lost the valuing of one another. We have lost the valuing of all of our earthly inhabitants. We see them as things we can use and they're dispensable, and they're not. We need a heart change in humility and love, coming together in unity as a species, prioritizing compassion for one another and for the earth, with technological ingenuity and a vision for future creatures, human and non-human, yet to be. For a heart change of this nature, the scripture kept coming to me, and I thought, this is really what we need. We need Philippians 2:1, which may provide a guiding principle for us to undergird this kind of biotheology. And the Apostle Paul says, make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, love for the earth, love for one another, love for God, being united in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or empty pride, but in humility, consider the others more important than yourselves. Each of you should not only look to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And I want to say here, others is not only referring to other humans, but to all of the more than human creatures and biomes with whom we share our common home. Humanity is in the midst of a spiritual evolution where survival of the fittest can involve a change in human relation, a change in attitude, a change in heart. Now, I know you're thinking this may seem hopeless, right? Or nearly hopeless given the condition of our world. But I believe the hope lies in the spirit of the human species that has gotten us here and the God who has given us the mandate that he has given us as humans. The aim then is for the human world family to rely on the human spirit of ingenuity and cooperation, using everything we have individually and collectively toward rethinking of human actions, infrastructures, and all forms of creaturely produced waste. As Rosling and Buitendijk says, the climate crisis needs our best science, although it cannot be solved by science alone. It requires courageous and visionary leadership, as well as interdisciplinary dialogue between science and other disciplines. And he sees religious studies as playing an important role. And that's why we're all here today, right? The good news is that such an interdisciplinary and intercultural scientific and dialogue has been in effect for decades, affirming cooperation on a grand scale. And I don't know if any of you follow this, but COP27 last year in Dubai was amazing. It was over almost 200 nations coming together, shaking hands, saying, yes, we're going to do this together. And so we're already seeing God acting in this way in humans. And we have all the technology and infrastructure that we need, by the way. We don't need anything more. We have everything we need. The only thing that's missing is being of one mind and purpose as a global species. So the theological and spiritual task at hand is not to adjudicate political or economic directives, but to seek revelation into the significance of God's action in the world toward the earth's healing in and through the spiritual evolution of the human species. And in such an evolution, we must now take to task God's divine action in the role of human spiritual healing to effectuate Earth's physical evolution. As we have seen, divine compositionalism proposes that God is acting on condition. However, this metaphysical construct plays out in human affairs in its explanatory power regarding several key elements. One, God's concurrentist mode of action in humans. And two, God's redemptive arc for humanity, the humans who are responsible and culpable for the secondary causation and human activity. And three, God has a plan. There's an eschatological plan for humans and the earth, a new heavens and a new earth, and the role of intercessory prayer. This coheres with both human free will and God's sovereign providential care. As there are a range of outcomes in any situation, the prayer of the faithful allows all humans to partner with the divine, effectuating an outcome, just one of the possible ends in a wide range of manifestations, based on divine wisdom and infinite compassion and love, because we're instructed to pray and believe. So thus, the divine action imperative in divine compositionalism shows that on the one hand, God has sovereign control over the physical and natural events in creation, as we see in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 7:13, which says, God owns it. I shut up the heavens. There's no rain. I command the locusts to devour the land. I send a plague among my people. God controls all natural events, even the seemingly destructive ones, for God has a reason. Well, on the other hand, divine compositionalism yields to a concurrentist modality between God and humanity to effectuate real and significant changes in human lives and by extension, the earth. And so let's read one more. Can we read one more verse in 2 Chronicles 7? The very next verse, Solomon says, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face. And here we go, friends, turn from their wicked ways. Stop the greed, stop the exploitation. Then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. This is a powerful promise. So divine compositionalism offers a way of understanding a divine human cooperation where humanity has the ability to transform future events toward the healing of our earth by humility and prayer. The hard prayer is for God to render a global shift in consciousness from anthropocentrism to biocentrism in what Moltmann envisions as an ecological spirituality, irrespective of religious commitments, but certainly strengthened by them. And a shift in consciousness into an ecological spirituality opens the possibility for an evolved human lineage to create those pictures that we saw ChatGPT create for us a few minutes ago, and even better, right? But it's optimally by us being like-minded, putting the needs of the Earth's healing at our center, by refitting and rebuilding our infrastructures with the spirit of cooperation toward a singular purpose, not just the survival of our species, which, by the way, is completely at stake right now. Let that sit in the room. But the equitable thriving of all species, renewed biodiversity. The healing of our Earth, it's only going to come from renewing the biodiversity and sustainable, healthy ecosystems for everybody. So this kind of cooperation with one another and the Earth proved successful in our evolutionary history once before, and may now again, if a processual spiritual evolution takes place where people who by God's loving spirit are united in spirit and purpose. So in conclusion, the biotheological anecdote to the imminent ecological precipice ascribes divine compositionalism as a preferred theistic view of divine action. On this view, God is acting in the natural world to unfold the processual evolution of the next step in Earth's history out of the creaturely waste produced by Homo sapiens. The movement toward the next step is truly biotheological. God, in and through the prayer of the faithful, reveals to humankind the necessary next steps in the Earth's biological evolution. Through humanity's spiritual evolution, collective cooperation, and unified ingenuity, which we already have all the technology we need, can effectuate global infrastructure changes toward a healthy ecoplanetary existence. Divine compositionalism as a novel theistic action position would stake the claim that God, the God who loves and owns the creation, is right now actively at work toward the good, fruitful, and abundant blessing emerging in the next step of Earth's biological history through a redemptive, biocentric spiritual evolution of the human heart. And this magnificent work of God can only elicit praise in the earth. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lisanne. We've had quite a few questions coming in the chat, and I'm sure there's probably more in the room as well. I feel really mean starting with this question because you finished on this really positive note, but we've got a couple that have come through on it. So thinking about the problem of evil and kind of negative connotations of this way of God working. Basically, if creation has no divinely conferred autonomy, does this give us a problem with regard to theodicy and the problem of evil? And then kind of related to that, although humankind is responsible for like unprecedented destruction and extinction of species, we know a huge number of species have gone extinct before we even arrived on the table. Therefore, don't we have to blame God for some of those extinctions? Yeah, so they're the kind of the first two. Sorry to start on a negative note, but yeah, let's go for those two.
Thank you so much, Finn. These are the perfect questions. These are the right questions, right? And so this really, I'll answer the first one and then the second one. So the first one is the problem of evil and suffering in nature. And this brings us back to this idea that was raised earlier in the conference about natural evil versus moral evil, right? And so as scientists, we don't see, if we see, the lion killing the antelope, as a moral evil or even a natural evil. It's part of the natural way that ecosystems thrive and live. And so how do we understand that? This is a very difficult area right now, in particular, in terms of animal sentience, and do animals have a soul, and do animals suffer, and how they suffer, and how do we understand that in terms of God's goodness? So I can't say I have thoroughly a satisfying answer for you, but hopefully I will in a year from now or so. But the way we view it in divine compositionalism is that, we see our reality in such a limited, finite manner. And I like to use analogies sometimes, because sometimes they always break down, but they help us a little. Could you imagine that all of the creation, God's created order, is like a giant tapestry? Maybe you'd go to a museum and see this beautiful tapestry. It takes up the whole wall. It's made of all these different threads, and it's a scene of a hunter and in the woods, and there's a castle in the background. You know what I'm talking about? These massive tapestries. If you step back, you see the whole scene. But if you're only looking in the tiny little left-hand corner, you're going to see a red thread and a green thread and a brown thread. You're going to say, this makes no sense to me. is stupid. It's insignificant. And so I think we have to always remember that when we ascribe a divine, infinite, loving creator, that is the character of God. Just because we do not see the entire tapestry does not mean that God has done something wrong, or God is, conferring evil. It's that we can't perceive the whole picture, and we will. And that's where we're called to remain faithful. We're not called to know everything. We're called to remain faithful. And so, so I see that, and as I brought up earlier in Luca's talk in the breakout room, when we see things in nature that are repugnant to us and are difficult to see, remember, all of the creation points to the glory of God. Nature, the beauty in nature and the systems in nature, everything that God has created points to the Creator, gives us some knowledge of God. All of the creation contains the knowledge, the glory of God. And so what about those repugnant things, the decaying carcass, in the woods, and you turn away, you can't look at it? Well, remember, if it's pointing us to God, we have a Savior that was brutally treated. We had a Savior that was crucified on a cross. And we see that in Isaiah, it says that, he was bruised for our iniquities. We couldn't even look upon his countenance. And so Alistair McGrath says that these repugnancies in nature, these horrors in nature that we can't look at, are pointing us to God. They're pointing us to the suffering Messiah, the suffering Savior that died on a cross, reminding us that this is part of the incarnation. This is part of our redemption, because it doesn't end there, right? These things get incorporated back into the earth and are resurrected into something new. And so those things point us to God's redemption arc in some way. And now what was the second part of the question?
The second one was thinking about, although we've been responsible for a lot of extinction and destruction,
yes.
It happened before we rocked up on the scene. So
Yes.
it probably ties in with what you're saying, actually, in response to the other question. But how much do we have to blame God for his involvement in that, or God's determination of those?
Absolutely. I never get God off the hook, because God doesn't get God off the hook. In Isaiah, God says, I, the Lord, have created destruction. He says in Isaiah 45, I, the Lord, have created evil. And so how do we understand God's involvement? God doesn't get God off the hook. We're always trying to. The problem of evil is a problem for us. And so, yes, we've had 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history. We are in the 6th right now. There's a wonderful book called The 6th Extinction, very well done by a journalist, a New York Times journalist, but very well informed scientifically. We're in the 6th extinction. And as I said in my talk, that, we're the ones who call extinct species dead end. We call it that. We've named it that. But that's not necessarily what God might see it as, right? So the dinosaurs were a dead end species. But without the dinosaurs, we would not have fossil fuel. All of our fossil fuels comes from the remains of dinosaurs, right, for millions of years. And so we see that God uses creatures. God takes it through these initiating conditions and manifestations, because there's another thing coming that God is preparing the creation for, which is why I love this idea of the catastrophe that we're in right now is nothing new. The earth has been in catastrophes before. And so this is just another way of God setting the stage for the next iteration. But the hope is that the human creature, the human species, is going to rise to this occasion and be the one. The previous extinctions, like the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, occurred over millions of years. They didn't just die in a day. It took millions of years for them to become extinct. We have seen a decimation of the marine environment in 20 years. So it's a very different planetary scheme that we see now. God taking it through sequentially, evolutionarily over millions of years for divine purposes for later iterations. Without the dinosaurs going extinct, we wouldn't have flowers. Flowers evolved after the extinction of the dinosaurs, right? And so, so we see that there's reasons behind that giant tapestry. The difference now is we see one species due to a spiritual sickness, which is greed, exploitation, and decimation of the environment, which we have never seen before. So this is where that concurrentist view of divine action has to be brought into the conversation, that human culpability is where we have to go with this. And God is allowing it. God is concurring with human action. But now we have to say, okay, what are we going to do?
Thank you. And that actually just feeds really nicely into one of the other questions in the chat, and then I'll come to you, Luca, and go back to a couple of the others if we've got time. Why does God's providential correction of human recklessness need to involve us in the solution, especially if the world isn't made just for us as humans?
Oh, this is such a great question. I love this question. Thank you for asking it, whoever asked it. I can't see the chat right now, but why does it even have to involve us? And this is where I feel that there is this partnering with the next evolutionary step in Earth's history, with an evolution of the human species. So I don't know if any of you have read any of the Jesuit anthropologist, theologian, Teilhard de Chardin. Anybody out there? And Teilhard, I love his anthropology because he says, really what we see from Genesis all the way up to present time is we see humanity has evolved going through a developmental stage, just like we were born as a baby. We couldn't do anything. We couldn't even eat. Then we grew teeth, and then we crawled, then we walked, and our parents taught us how to walk. And so we see in all animal development, there are stages. And he says, okay, the Garden of Eden, that was the baby humans. They were in their playpen of the Garden of Eden, and then God says, okay, you're ready now, get out. You've discovered it all now. There's good and evil. So time to get into the world. And then we see in the Old Testament, this anthropological developmental process of humans trying to figure out the natural world and trying to figure out other tribes and how do we manage our land and we're warlike. And, we're seeing a lot of anthropomorphism in the Old Testament in terms of God's acting and the way they're viewing themselves. And so Teilhard goes through this series and says, God is committed. He says that I will commit to fulfilling my plans and purposes in you, and I will conform you to the image of my son. And so God has made a commitment to the human species. And part of that commitment is our spiritual evolution at this point. And so we're at a crossroads right now. We can either go down the spiritual degradation that we have been going down in these, non-traits of God, right? These are sinful acts of greed and exploitation and all of the things that we've done. Production of waste for profit and not caring about marginalized people or animals or ecosystems, that's sinful. Or we can evolve into the higher beings that we were meant to be. And Paul Tillich talks about Jesus as the new being. Jesus is our example. We as humans have this wonderful capacity. And I think this was Gavin, I think this was you, were saying that we have this capacity for creativity. We have this capacity for greatness. Are we going to evolve into that? Or are we going to devolve and that's going to just decimate things? And who knows what God's plan would be then? I don't know. But I know right now, at times such as this, we have an opportunity. And so that's why God is using the human creature, because it's not just about, yes, it's about the earth, but the earth was made for humans and humans for the earth. We go together. We're not separate. We're an animal. We're in the animal kingdom. And so we need to unify ourselves with the earth, but our spiritual evolution, I believe, can make that happen.
Thank you. Brilliant response. Luca, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a very interesting talk. I wonder also whether the last question that was asked shows the importance to have like a dialectic between biocentrism, yes, but also focusing on the human. So there is like this need of both, because if you focus too much on biocentrism, then man loses its uniqueness. And if you focus only on human, then you tend to have a dualistic relation between human and non-human nature. I think this is one thing I wanted to underline. But the second is that, you mentioned, I think your talk is very consonant also with a panentheistic view of the Trinity, because the Trinity, as you know, can explain like the diversity of being, because the divine procession within the Trinity lead also to the distinction of different divine persons, but also are the cause for the distinction of beings in creation. So if this is true, caring for the natural world, the created world, is also caring for the immanent aspect of God.
Yes.
So
exactly.
so if you cure natural world, then the Trinity can do its work and diversify. I don't know.
Lisa, thank you so much for this comment. And you and I have got to write a paper on this together. Promise me we will do this, okay? Because this is really important. I think that we tend as humans to elevate ourselves, and we see the natural world as lesser. And then, or in some circles, we see it's all about the environment. It's all about the environment. And what about humans? And so we have to find the right balance. We are part of the natural world. Humans, when I tell my students, you are an animal. I'm not saying that because of your behavior. You're an animal because you are Homo sapiens. We have a classification for you. You are a physical being in the world, but they don't see themselves as that because we've been so separated by our technology and living in boxes and living in homes, and we're not used to being consonant with the natural world. But we are. The natural world needs us, and we need it to survive. And so, how do we find that balance? God has put us in charge. God has given us a divine mandate, and we've abused it. As you and I spoke about briefly earlier, in the Old Testament, when God tells Adam to have dominion, say, over the creation, that is the word shamar, and the word shamar is the word that God uses in the mandate in Deuteronomy, where it says, "The Lord bless you and keep you." So God is telling Adam to shamar the land, to bless and keep the land. And that's where I think we've misunderstood the scriptures, and we need to come back to that. What is the role of humans? What is the role of the environment? How do we live coexist together? And how do we have a dual respect, one for the other?
Thank you very much, Lisanne. I'm sure these questions could continue for a lot longer, but I am aware of time, so I think we're going to say a massive thank you once again to you. Certainly prompted us to end the conference with us probably more questions than we started with. So I think a very positive questioning end to the conference. So despite it being a precipice, I think a lot of conversation to be had. So thank you ever so much for that.